Well, I really appreciate the invitation to be with you here today. I notice already at least one person in the room who knows more about this topic than I do, but I think the most important point I want to make today is just how important this topic is. The U.S. economy is in the process of recovering from a financial crisis and a recession of historic proportions. The consequences of those events are still reverberating throughout the U.S. economy and indeed still around the globe. And it's been clear for years now that we will be dealing with the consequences of those events for many years to come. So what I'd like to do today is to discuss with you one particular aspect of those events, namely some dimensions of the macroeconomy. That's only one aspect, and I don't mean to suggest that that's all that has been wrought by the Great Recession. But it is very important. It has enormously important consequences in a variety of different dimensions. It matters enormously for fiscal policy. It matters for the standard of living that our children will inherit. It may have important consequences for monetary policy, and I want to discuss toward the end of my talk a little bit about why I qualify it with the phrase that it may have those consequences. Now there are the Great Recession has generated an awful lot of important questions that are related to dimensions of the macroeconomy. I've listed a few of those here. I'm not going to go into all of those questions in any depth. I think there's a circumstantial case that can be made that the productive capacity of the economy was severely affected by the events of the Great Recession. If so, it would be handy to have some estimates about the magnitude of those effects. Those effects have important consequences for gauging how much slack or unused capacity remains. That's relevant to the Federal Reserve because the Fed's task is to try to conduct a monetary policy that ensures both price stability and maximum sustainable employment. So question number 2, how much unused productive capacity bears directly on the Fed's so-called maximum employment mandate. The third question that I will pose but not address today is the question of how much of the damage of the Great Recession might be reversible. Remarkably little, to my knowledge, is known about that question. The answer to that, I think, substantially, there's a lot of interesting speculation and sort of early stage spade work about that, I would say, at this point. It's one of those questions that will be a whole lot clearer on 5 to 10 years from now. And the fourth is something that I live with on a pretty much constant basis. What are the implications for monetary policy? There, I would say, in a sort of preview, I think it depends quite a lot on the details of the situation. What I'm going to do in remarks that, if anything, will probably run a bit short, or address some of those questions. I'm going to be piggybacking off of some research that I did with 2 of my colleagues at the Federal Reserve, Dave Reichschneider and Bill Washer. This is a paper that is in the process of being published in the IMF Economic Bulletin, Economic Review. The questions I am going to discuss today are: what happened? What do we think? How do we gauge through the lens of the particular statistical apparatus that we use? How big a gauge, what metric do we put on the damage that was inflicted on the productive capacity of the U.S. economy? There's an interesting question here that sounds a little bit like a question out of the Watergate hearings. If question number one was what did we know, question number two is when could we have known it? It's a consequential issue because economic data are riven with noise. That's just a fact of life. It's the way it is. Data are subject to revision. You have to be querying, challenging, questioning those data and asking. These puzzles never fit together. It's like a jigsaw puzzle that needs a lot of sanding paper. And what I'll show is that there was an important instance of this where the early estimates actually were pretty encouraging for the consequences of the Great Recession and the financial crisis for the productive capacity of the economy. It didn't look like there was going to be a big amount of damage, but later on it became abundantly clear that that would not be the case. And then toward the end of the talk, I'll turn to the implications for monetary policy. Nothing here that I'm going to talk about is not in the public domain. It's all in the paper that's currently available on the IMF website. And I should emphasize that these are my views based on research that I've conducted with my two colleagues, and I can assure you that this is not an official statement of the Federal Reserve. I should also point out to John that his naming me the third most powerful person will come as a considerable surprise to at least the Vice Chairman of the Federal Reserve, the other members of the Open Market Committee, a very large number, not to mention a Defense Secretary, a Treasury Secretary. There's a lot of... Yeah, okay, well, I'd probably get scolded if I went home letting that statement go unchallenged. Okay, so I'm married to a journalist. She tells me all the time, don't bury the lead. So here's my takeaways on today. Man, there is a lot of uncertainty. One thing I want to impress upon you is that the monetary policy environment is riven with uncertainty. It is pervasive, and that has profound implications for how, in my view, one ought to think about the questions that we're going to talk about this afternoon. Much of the discussion, it seems to me, I don't actually think there's that much difference of opinion when you read the various research papers. For example, much has been posed lately about whether I was a little uncomfortable actually to have the Wall Street Journals counterpose the Wilcox view with the Fernald view. John Fernald is on the staff at the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco. I think there's much less disagreement about those two, what was characterized about those two views in my perceiving than is sometimes portrayed. By the way, I was a little surprised to find out some aspects of what the Wilcox view are. So that was news. It's always interesting to learn about my views in the newspaper. Now, that said, I am going to present some evidence from one model that we work with that suggests that I think it makes, at least to me, a thought-provoking case. I'm going to try to put forward a pretty soft claim, a thought-provoking case that the Great Recession inflicted a good deal of damage on the productive capacity. A significant portion of that happened through a decline in capital investment, and what that did was it affected the productivity of American workers. There is a deeper concept of productivity called multi-factor productivity that measures the productivity of the capital stock and the American worker put together. If you have a bundle of capital and some labor, you still haven't totally answered how much output you're going to get for that. The answer to that question is multi-factor productivity. That's sort of the factor X for how productive the economy is. That factor X is probably where most of the disagreement occurs. Again, in the paper, we see some evidence suggesting that it's plausible that there was some slowdown in the pace of improvement in factor X, and that slowdown may have been, could have plausibly been affected by a reduction in research and development spending, or the formation of new businesses. And that's to me, a plausible causal chain, that if you think of new businesses as being a hotbed of innovation in the economy where new ideas are incorporated, that a slowdown in new business formation might be a bad thing for the pace of innovation in the economy as a whole. On labor markets, there's some mixed evidence, but I'm going to present at least one piece of evidence that is, to my eye, relatively encouraging about the recuperation of the functioning of the labor market from the events of the Great Recession. And then we'll get to monetary policy at the end. Okay, so let me give you just a little bit of a taste of the sort of statistical apparatus that that I'm going to use. And here I'm going to be pretty oblique because this isn't the part that you'll be interested in. But there is a statistical foundation on which these results are built. And that foundation starts from the specification of a statistical model. That model has a basic description of how some key elements of the economy behave. These are just basic building blocks of the economy. They're things like capital and labor. The description is a little more detailed than I've just given you. But the basic effort here, the whole thrust of the statistical exercise is going to be to try to tease out two pieces from those basic building blocks of the economy. One is a trend piece, and one's a business cycle piece. And that's pretty much it. Now, the one piece of economics so this is going to be an elaborate exercise in statistical curve fitting. We are going to introduce one piece of economics, and that's a description of the basic forces that determine inflation. Why is it that inflation gets faster or runs slower? And the economics that's in that description of how inflation behaves is basically that when the economy is running with more slack capacity, that's going to tend to put downward pressure on inflation. And that's maybe gives you just a little bit of intuition for why it might be relevant to introduce a description of inflation into a model that is attempting to discern the cyclical behavior, cyclical position of the American economy. We're going to use inflation as a very noisy indicator of cyclical behavior. And it helps a little bit. Only a little bit because it's a really noisy indicator. Now we're going to go ahead and estimate this model. I think John would probably march me out of the room if I uttered the words Kalman filter. So I'll just say that we're going to use this using very standard statistical techniques that are borrowed from the engineering literature. What's convenient, handy about that is that this statistical approach generates not only estimates of the key variables that we're interested in, but also gives us some important measures of uncertainty. So there's one aspect of what we're going to do that's, I think, quite cool that I want to take just a moment to pause on, and that is that there is in this model, there resides at the core of this model, there resides a variable that describes the cyclical position of the economy relative to its sustainable position. That's kind of a key premise of the model, that there is some useful concept about the economy having a position today relative to its sustainable position. And what the model posits is that all the different indicators that we're going to use of the macroeconomic performance of the economy, things that are familiar like GDP or the unemployment rate, that they all reflect this basic cyclical position of the economy, maybe with different cyclical timing, but that they are reflections like the shadows on the back of the cave, they are imperfect reflections of the cyclical position of the economy. Now, two others of my colleagues at the Fed, Charles Fleischman and John Roberts, developed a really nice, elegant framework for operationalizing this basic approach. And the basic idea is that we're going to use multiple indicators to try to infer this cyclical position of the economy. Now, the reason, why do I mention this? Because I'm really enthused about it, because it gives you the framework for what the program is going to be for much of our work at the Federal Reserve for the next couple of years. We're going to be aggressively pursuing a systematic program of attempting to make sure that we're bringing to bear in a statistically efficient manner all the indicators that we can to try to discern what in a much more formalized way than we've done in the past, what the cyclical position of the economy is, and what's new and innovative about this is that there's a whole new world of economic measurement now that's available. There are new non-traditional sources of information. Matt Shapiro, for example, has done some really interesting research on using social media to measure aspects of labor market behavior. Well, could we put those to work? I don't know. I don't know whether those will be useful or not. We haven't tested it. So this will be about a systematic program of testing those kinds of indicators. So, three questions. What happened? When could we have known it? And where, in what particular dimensions of the economy did the damage occur? This graph in one picture gives pretty much the whole story. The blue line, let's see if I can learn where the laser pointer is. Top green button. Okay, the blue line here gives you our model's estimate of the productive capacity of the economy expressed in terms of GDP. And what the green line does is it answers a very particular question. The green line says if we took the average over some prior period before the Great Recession, the period we happen to use is from 2000 through 2007, and we take the average growth rate and we just extrapolate, we just jump off from the level in 2007 at the average growth rate from 2007 forward, where would the economy be? And by the way, many other authors have used approaches that are similar in spirit to this. For example, Bob Hall, who's in the audience today, has done an exercise that's quite similar to this. So, in fact, what we know is that circumstances intervened, and the world did not unfold at all like its pre-2007 trend. What happened was the Great Recession. The red line shows actual GDP. So actual GDP peaked right here and teetered along for a little bit and then fell into a steep decline, particularly in 2008 and 2009, and then has since then had what by historical standards has been quite a slow, grinding recovery. And as you can see, it hasn't come anywhere near to recovering its pre-recession trend. So while this sluggish behavior of actual GDP was unfolding, what our model has inferred is that for a variety of reasons, importantly influenced by the behavior of inflation, but not solely that, it must be the case that the productive capacity of the economy is on a flatter trend. And because of the timing of this inflection point, we raise the question as to whether or not it might not be the case that there's a causal relationship between the events of the Great Recession and that slower growth trajectory. Now, I've mentioned uncertainty a couple of times. The blue shaded region gives you an estimate, that the most natural estimate that comes out of this model of uncertainty. This is a 95% confidence interval that says that if our model is right, there's a 19 out of 20 chance that the truth is somewhere in the blue shaded region. Now, what I want to make sure is that you know that I know that if anything, that confidence interval, if anything, is too narrow because it ignores lots of uncertainty. It's constructed on the hypothesis, for example, that our model is correct, and we know that that isn't right. No model, no econometric model has yet been constructed that's correct in a formal statistical sense. So there's lots of room here for uncertainty, and what we hope we're doing is sort of capturing broad trends. Now, one way to quantify the extent of what happened is to ask, well, supposing supposing that whatever happened in 2007, 2008, 2009 had not occurred, where would the productive capacity be? And by our model's estimates, this gap here is about 7% wide here, and getting wider. So the consequences here are enormous in terms of if there really is a lost capacity for sustainable output, then the consequences for the economic welfare of the country are absolutely huge. Moreover, those consequences are continuing to grow because the trajectory of the economy here is flatter than the trajectory in the pre-crisis period. So there's been an awful lot of work on trying to estimate what the implications of a more subdued trajectory for economic sustainable output might be for the policy objective of the Federal Reserve. This graph attempts to get at that by subtracting potential output from actual output. And what it shows is what's commonly referred to as an output gap together with a confidence interval. And you can see that by the lights of this model, at the depths of the recession, GDP was about 7% below its sustainable position. And we've been recovering since then. However, the pace of the recovery has been really slow. This recovery now is five or 6 years into the making, still by the lights of this model, still incomplete as of mid-2014. And so the job of returning the economy to its sustainable cyclical position is not yet done. Again, notice how wide the uncertainty is. According to this model, it's not implausible that the economy in mid-2014, roughly speaking, was already at its sustainable position, or it might have been about 4% short. Now, the central estimate is that it was about 2% short of its sustainable position in mid-2014. What about that question, the sort of Watergate-style question of when could we have known it? This graph is a little complicated when you first look at it, but I want to get you used to it and get you thinking that you can tease out what the implications are. My colleague Dave Reichschneider did a really clever thing here. He said, let's re-estimate the model with different vintages of data. This line here, the sort of split pea soup colored line, which ends right here, shows you the trajectory of potential output that the model estimated based on data that were available in 2008. in June of 2008. So this was before the worst of the onset of the financial crisis. Things really got bad in the fall of 2008. So this was before then. Now what happened was a year later, what Dave did was he went back and fed in actual estimates as available in June of 2009 and asked the model again, what do you think? Well, the model comes back and says, now these data are available, the actual so-called actuals were available through here, and beyond that is projections. Now what the model was projecting was, hey, not so bad. The unemployment rate has started to go up, but based on the constellation of factors, the model, am not particularly worried. Doesn't look like the sustainable productive capacity of the economy has yet been damaged. By June of 2010, a little bit of discouraging news because the latest the annual revision that was released in the summer of 2009 was not as favorable, but it was in the summer of 2010 that, statistically speaking, the roof really fell in. And the national income accounts were revised to show a much deeper economic recession. And that's when this model would have decided, wow, there's something really very bad going on here with respect to the productive capacity of the economy. Since then, things deteriorated somewhat further one more time, but have been mostly stable since then. And if we're going to split hairs, have even improved in the latest vintage of data that we used. Those that were available in June of 2014. Those were looking just a little bit better through the lens of this particular model than the preceding two cohorts of data. So it's a real sort of morality story or parable for humility if you're in the business of economic forecasting, because again, you always have to query what doesn't fit in this picture. Where's the statistical noise in the economic data? Nothing can be taken as truth. Now, I'm going to show you just a couple of slices on the question of where the damage might have occurred. This is one dimension that people care about an awful lot in the economy, namely the unemployment rate. And in particular, a key question is what's the sustainable rate of the unemployment rate? And that's referred to by economists as the natural rate. There's nothing particularly natural about it, but that's the name that it's given. Pre-financial crisis, the model put that natural rate somewhere in the neighborhood of about 5%. With the onset of the financial crisis, as was documented by Bob Hall and others, there was some deterioration in the in the behavior of labor markets. There's a lot of debate, disagreement about what the dimensions of that deterioration are. Our model happens to put the deterioration denominated in units of the unemployment rate at about a half a percentage point, from something in the neighborhood of 5% up to 5.5%. And then what's encouraging, possibly, maybe, is that the model estimates for the natural rate seem to have come down more recently. Now, part of that reflects the fact that inflation has continued to be really low even as the recovery has progressed. And so part of the model's inference is derived from that fact. If the economy were really getting snug, our model would expect to see a little bit of upward pressure on inflation, and our model just isn't seeing that. So that's part of what's driving the improved assessment of the sustainable rate of the unemployment rate. Another key aspect of the labor market that analysts care about a lot is what fraction of the population is actually participating in the labor market. Those could be people who are either employed or people who would like to work and are sufficiently active in their search for work to be recorded by the BLS as unemployed. Our assessment is that the demographics play a really important role. What you can see here is that the labor force participation was more or less flat through much of the 1990s. Since then, it's really declined dramatically. The red line gives you the actual labor force participation rate. It's declined absolutely dramatically. Now, our model, which is pretty mindless and it's just a statistical machine that's looking for a trend that has certain particular characteristics, it attributes most of this decline to the trend and not to cyclical weakness. According to the model, there is a little bit of cyclical weakness. My confidence in something like that being roughly about right is bolstered by the fact that several of my labor market specialist colleagues, Stephanie Aronson, Bruce Follick, Andrew Figura, Jonathan Pingle, and Bill Washer, published a paper in the Brookings Papers on Economic Activity, and they published it right here. This is a really cool real-time experiment in economic science, because they published it right here. And they said, we think, based on demographic factors, that the labor force participation rate is going to decline dramatically from here forward. Now, what's cool about that is they then, history rolled forward, and they were invited to write an update of their paper right about here. And I'll be darned if they didn't turn out to be more or less right. Now, they probably turned out to be right, maybe in some sense for a little bit of the wrong reason. But they were a whole lot, it was a very controversial claim at the time when they made that, when they staked that claim in 2006. And they turned out to be a whole lot more right than most of the rest of the world. So it was very cool, and I think the real-time nature of that makes their basic claim, in my mind, really quite credible. I mentioned that capital investment seems to be a big part of what's going on. This is the contribution of capital to worker productivity. So as firms invest in more plant and equipment, that all else equals, that makes their workers more productive. Right here is the onset of the recession, and what you can see is that the capital stock started growing a whole lot less rapidly here. And by this measure of capital services actually shrank. And if you think about taking the integral sort of under a horizontal line right here, there's a whole heap of missing capital investment that didn't occur. And again, we haven't demonstrated a causal link, but the timing is plausible. Now, what we don't explain here is this surge in capital investment, and John Fernald, I think, has pointed in a different dimension to a different concept of productivity about this period as being very important in understanding what comes later. So let's talk a little bit about possible implications for monetary policy. First, actually, compared to Alan Auerbach's specialty, fiscal policy, I would say that the consequences for monetary policy are a little more limited. Why do I say that? Mainly because monetary policy is kind of like sending a rocket ship to the moon. Now, there never once, I say, not having ever been inside a NASA facility to the best of my memory. There never once was a case where NASA launched a rocket from Cape Canaveral and radioed up to the astronauts, hey, good luck with that, folks. Hope you end up like you were targeted at the right place. Let us know how it goes, and if you swing on by, hope you got some extra rations on board. What happens, in fact, is that they know that the rocket ship isn't going to be quite aimed in the right place, or wind conditions off the coast of Florida were going to be a little different than what they had anticipated. So what do? They get a third of the way to the moon, and they fire one of those thruster rockets for 15 seconds on the left side of the rocket ship. And then they get 2/3 of the way to the moon, and they're still not headed quite right to the bay of whatever, where they wanted to end up. So they fire a thruster rocket on the front of the rocket for 10 seconds to get things squared away. Now, monetary policy is a lot like that, but I would argue on steroids, because the monetary policy environment is one which is riven in every dimension with uncertainty. Shocks are hitting the economy all the time. The structure of the economy is evolving in ways that we can never fully understand. We know that we have flawed, imperfect models, and we also know that any single model will overstate. If you paid attention to any single model, you'd have too much confidence in the empirical structure of what you were doing. So for that reason, mid-course corrections are absolutely coded into the normal behavior of monetary policy. And that's why I would argue that the topics we're talking about today are important for monetary policy, but they're, I would say, not the end-all and be-all, because we know that in every respect that our understanding of the economy is imperfect. And I know that in this respect, our understanding of the consequences of the Great Recession for the productive capacity of the economy is imperfect also. So we're going to do a whole lot of mid-course corrections. So that's what you'll see actually playing out over the next many years, probably. That said, in the paper that's coming out in the IMF Journal, we do try to illustrate some possible consequences. And being good two-handed economists, I'm going to give you a little on the one hand. The kinds of things we're talking about could make you, as a policymaker, want to respond to an adverse cyclical shock, a recession. You might want to respond really aggressively, and I'm going to give you some good reasons for responding really aggressively to a recession. On the other hand, you might, for very serious and important reasons, want to respond with great restraint, and there's not going to be a right answer to that, and I suspect however many people in this audience there probably will be that many different answers to these questions. So let me try to illustrate. For the sake of time, I'm going to go to the bookends. Supposing you knew that a deep recession was on the way, supposing you were persuaded, maybe more than I would really want you to, that there is a causal link between cyclical weakness and the productive capacity of the economy, but that damage hasn't happened yet. And supposing you knew with great confidence that if you stepped on the gas pedal for the economy really hard, you might be able to avert some of that damage by providing support to the economy. You might be able to avert some of that damage. That might be the gist of sort of the case for great monetary policy aggressiveness in response to an impending cyclical weakness. Why might you think that? Well, let me just illustrate, say, with the labor market. If you knew that a whole lot of people were going to be unemployed, and that being unemployed for a long time has very adverse consequences for skills, for labor market attachment, for the networks that people have with one another, you might want to prevent all of that from ensuing if you thought that there was avoidable damage that you could prevent. Let me go to the bookend case. Supposing you were apprehensive that and this is situation number 4, supposing you were apprehensive that by providing a whole lot of cyclical support to the economy, what does that mean? Well, that translates into a policy of holding interest rates very low for very long. You might have concerns about the consequences of that. You might be concerned that people would be taking inappropriate risk, so-called reach for yield, that sort of thing. You might be concerned that the hard work that the Federal Reserve has done to instill confidence in our inflation objective, that might become undermined. If those concerns were prominent in your mind, then you might exercise great restraint, even in the face of an impending cyclical weakness. So this is I'm trying to illustrate there isn't a right answer. These are the kinds of genuinely difficult questions that policymakers have to weigh. I think with that, I will conclude and look forward to your questions. I take a
Who's
seat.
going to go
John,
first?
you think?
John, yes.
Is
Why
there
not?
any way that you can figure in the international aspects, like on capital? If you have Apple develop with their intellectual capital a new design for the smartphone, and then all of the parts, all of the product is made overseas, and so the capital expenditure occurs in China. It seems like there's a whole integrated global economy that kind of makes it very hard to tell what the hell's happening.
That's true. But I think in the interest of time, I'll just say that we work really hard to try to take account of international influences on the U.S. economy and implications of U.S. economic performance and policy for international economies. One of the really important channels of monetary policy is the exchange rate these days. And so with the increasing globalization that you're referring to, it's absolutely crucial that we take account of our relative price position compared to our trading partners and try to be realistic in our assessment of, for example, where the investment in plant and equipment is going to take place. It does add another dimension of complexity, I think, to the overall effort at analysis.
Sure. We have a question here.
So I'm the aforementioned Bob Hall. So I think you know that we're very much in tune with each other, and even though I took a very different approach, more of a trying to dig in and use a growth model to understand it, gives very similar results. In particular, that the disappointment in productivity, which Fernald says is not the result of the crisis, the decline in labor force participation, which I very much agree with your analysis. I think the place where we probably slightly disagree, for one thing, you stopped in the middle of 2014, and we're getting close to the middle of 2015 now. What's happened in the labor market has been quite dramatic in getting us, I think, very close to a reasonable measure of full employment. Now, that might sound like I'm saying that the monetary policy should start to tighten. We should, as they say, normalize it. But I think that's wrong, because I think we're going through a sequence that we went through earlier, in the two previous recoveries, in which I think unemployment is headed down into the 4%, low 4% range as it went unemployment went down to 3.8% in the late 90s. So So we should do what Greenspan did, which is to keep our eye on what's happening to inflation, which is, of course, absolutely nothing, as opposed to saying that just because we've gotten in the low 5% range for unemployment that we automatically need to tighten. I think we should pay a lot of attention to what's happening in the labor market. The labor market indicators suggest very strongly that we're moving in that direction. For example, new entry to unemployment is at an all-time low. The number of people becoming unemployed every month now is lower than it's been since the survey was created in 1948. I mean, that's a stunning accomplishment, and that looking forward, I think that means that as we're finally working off this legacy of long-term unemployment, but that's falling quite rapidly, and we're just getting no new unemployment. So I think we're headed into the low 4% range, and I think that's going to be fine. I think it's, like 1997 over again. That's a very comfortable place to be.
So I've gotten practiced over the years at answering a different question. The results that I presented are based on material that's all going to be in the published paper and therefore is in the public domain. One piece of work, I actually want to build on your comment with regard to long-term unemployment. Conditions there have been improving quite a lot. One dimension that might cause a good deal of concern is if you looked at the pace with which long-term unemployed are finding jobs. There's one data series, I'm not going to go into the technicalities of it, but there's one data series that could suggest that's, I think, probably maybe the conventional one, that the success of people who've been who've been unemployed for a long time, that success is just lagging, stuck in the mud. And if that's correct, that would be pretty discouraging and would be one key symptom of something called hysteresis. Hysteresis is basically if you impinge a system, it doesn't push back. It just stays in its hit state. Now, there's another way of looking. There's really quite an interest. So I'm gonna educate you here a little bit about the way that we collect unemployment data. It's really interesting. If you are drawn into the Bureau of Labor Statistics a sample where they go around and they ask 60,000 households about their labor market experience. First of all, let me ask, please participate. It's really, really, really important. There's a rather low probability that you'll ever be drawn into the sample, but please do. You'll be in for 4 months. You'll be out for 12 months, and then you'll be in for 4 more months. And there's been an awful lot of work to take advantage of this rather rich structure that you can actually look at the same person in their first 4-month stint and then come back and look at them again a year later. And the picture that you get out of that examination is really quite a bit more encouraging than the one that you get if you just look at the month-to-month movement. Bob's paper in the Macro Annual 2014 bears on some of these questions. Hey, I haven't seen your new paper.
Come on.
There's a really nice Fed's, so we have a little franchise now called Fed's Notes, which is intended to be sort of bite-sized pieces of economic analysis at a less technical level. There's a very nice Fed's Note on our website by 2 of our labor market economists, Tomaj Seiner and David Ratner, that looks into these issues. It's from the summer of 2014. So I commend it to you.
You have a question here?
Question, I'm not sure whether this is totally within the scope of your subject, but I would be very interested in knowing, does the Fed consider in its monetary policy 2 factors, one being the state of leverage in the economy, of which certainly we've seen excessive leverage in 1929 and certainly excessive leverage in housing and so on in the recent Great Recession. And secondly, do you consider whether there are enablers, what I would call enablers, such as the discovery of the steam engine, which is the discovery of the automobile, and more recently, in the 20th century, the discovery of the semiconductor, which are providing huge numbers of new jobs, and the earlier ones provided the transition of all the people off the farms without great depressions resulting from that into the industrial things. Are you providing that now? And is the Fed looking at the fact that in many respects we are looking for the next great enabler after the semiconductor and DNA?
So the answer to those questions are yes and yes. On leverage, I think one of the really sort of path-breaking, intellectual, precedent-shattering pieces of leadership that Ben Bernanke performed was to point the way for us as an organization, and really, I would claim, for us worldwide, point the way to the importance of financial stability as a concern for monetary policy. So we've built up a huge amount of effort around the topic of financial stability, and leverage is one of the key variables that bears on financial stability. There's a whole lot more to it than leverage, but leverage is one of the key aspects of that. On enablers, you bet. In fact, that's a lot of what the sort of interesting element of the debate around the topics that I was talking about. That's what a lot of it revolves around, is what the long-term future is. Now, fortunately, as difficult as monetary policy is, really the most relevant horizon is probably 1 to 2 to 3 years out. And so many of the enablers that you talk about, the real debate has to do with techno-optimists versus techno-pessimists. To what extent have the benefits of the semiconductor already played out? Now, there's a lot of, you mentioned steam engines. There's a really rich line of literature that suggests that it took decades to fully take advantage of the development of the steam engine, and that it literally meant that you had to lay out the shop floor differently. That wasn't something that could be retrofitted in from one year to the next. Entrepreneurs around the world are in the business of, in effect, laying out the shop floor differently to fully take advantage of things like the information technology revolution. And so the question is, has that substantially played out, and the benefits of that have been captured because the retail sector, for example, now has utterly different inventory management practices? Or are there yet great innovations to come? And we simply don't know the answer to that. Fortunately, we don't have to design monetary policy for 25 years from now. We have to design it for the present and the near future in a small handful of years.
We'll have one last question.
So when you switch to monetary policy going for unemployment and inflation, what if they're not connected just right? In other words, the assumption that you can fix one or fix the other, but maybe you can't fix them both at the same time, which comes into what he was saying is if you bring the unemployment really way down, still you might not have inflation if you have other things that are messing with those numbers, like retirement funds. Like maybe people had enough, and so less people are going back. And then you have the people who have quit and all that. And what if they're not connected? Then what?
It's a great question. There's like Macroeconomics 101. I could refer you to Bob Hall's textbook for the complete answer to that question. I guess sorry? That's why there's going to be new editions of Bob Hall's textbook. It's a very complicated question. I would say that for purposes of tonight, the starting point for the answer is that, in fact, Bob, forgive me, but I'm going to simplify it a little here. In the long run, for the most part, standard models suggest they're not connected, and that's why it's in fact feasible for the Fed to have what's referred to as a dual mandate, full employment and maximum sustainable employment. if they were connected in a sort of tight mechanical way in the long run, we couldn't achieve desired objectives on both of those two variables. But the interesting thing is that because substantially in the long run they are unconnected, that is really the key for why we can logically be given. By the way, this is a job that's given to us by the Congress. We didn't go around making this up. The Congress told us, you've got two jobs, maximum employment, price stability. Now, it turns out that in broad strokes, economic theory actually says that's perfectly fine. That's an achievable objective, and that's what we take our job to be. So I think I'll leave it for that with a teaser for much further discourse.
I'm going to modify my statement that he's the third most powerful person in the United States. And I'm going to say that he's the fourth most important, and that way 100 people can think they're the third.
That's very diplomatic.